Well, at long last, Cole vs. Alex is finally behind us. After years upon years of being requested and predicted, the group of people that have been wanting this matchup since basically the show's premiere can finally rest, and we can all move on. Anyways, let's talk about Frieza vs. Megatron. Now, I know that this matchup by itself is pretty polarizing amongst the general community, with some people thinking it's good and many thinking it's bad, including Nemesis, who made an entire video dedicated to breaking this matchup down and explaining its flaws. To which I mostly agree with everything he said. Despite that, I was still looking forward to seeing what the Death Battle team was going to do with this matchup, since on a surface level fight aspect, this episode had a lot going for it. Plus, while Dragon Ball has been kind of oversaturated and leaving a lot of people burned out after the last year's season, Transformers hasn't had an episode come out since Optimus Prime vs. Gundam, which was 5 years ago, believe it or not. So it's nice to see such an iconic and popular franchise get some well-needed attention on this show. Anyways, that's enough preamble, let's dive in, shall we? The rundowns were pretty standard. Frieza's I found to be the least interesting out of the two because there wasn't really much to offer on his part that most other Dragon Ball rundowns haven't already covered. It did have some interesting parts, like Frieza being modeled after real estate tycoons, which is something I did not know, as well as covering some of the new super stuff and some new feats that have been brought up before, like the Ki blasts traveling from Earth to the Kai world, as well as the destructive force needed to destroy planet Vegeta. But the rest of it is just standard versus stuff and power scaling, and overall was just failing to keep me engaged. Rundowns are usually more interesting to me when they manage to weave their stories into them while also going over their abilities in a way that feels natural. But Frieza, a character that hardly has a story of his own outside of the actual main Dragon Ball story, that makes it really hard. So this rundown became less about story and character and more about abilities and power scaling. And it's unfortunately what happens when you have a franchise as lucrative as Dragon Ball, when there's so many characters and they all scale to basically the same stuff, especially the higher end ones. It just makes it very repetitive and it's just hard to keep it engaged. Megatron's I found to be way more interesting. He was a character that I comparatively knew very little about outside of the very little Transformers media I've seen, like Transformers Prime for example. But hearing about his admittedly very interesting story was honestly pretty fun and engaging. He also had a lot of weird and diverse powers which were fun to learn about, like his panic bubble, and they also found a way to poke fun at the classic G1 cartoon silliness by dedicating a small section to talking about how Megatron used to just turn himself into a gun, which was a fun exchange that I really enjoyed. Both of the cutaways were nothing special, they didn't really add a lot to my overall enjoyment, and I did actually like the way Megatron's ended. I didn't know that he eventually ends up changing sides and joining the Autobots after realizing the error of his ways. It was pretty interesting to learn about, even though I'm unsure if it's a part about Megatron's character that I like or think it's appropriate for the character. I'm not knowledgeable enough about Transformers nor their characters enough to comment on that, so maybe if I read more of the IDW comics or just watch more Transformers media, I'll get like a more thorough understanding of Megatron and if that kind of stuff is like accurate, but I don't know, this is unimportant. Though regardless if I like it or not, it definitely does fly in the face of the core connective trait between these two, which is kind of a shame, but I guess you could consider that a bit of a contrast between the two. Anyways, rundowns aside, let's move on to the fight, and I honestly really enjoyed it. What immediately stood out to me were the visuals of this fight. All of the lighting and effects in this animation were really spectacular. All of the energy blasts and stuff look really pretty and really cool, except for the Energon Mace. While it was used really well in the fight animation itself, it is in fact all one unshaken color of purple and there was no shading on it at all, and I wish there was because it kind of looks weird in a scene where everything is mostly dimly lit. It's not that big of a deal and it's far from the biggest sin in this episode, but it's just something that I wanted to point out. But my point still stands. Visually, this episode is probably the best of the season so far, as well as the cinematography. There are some great shots throughout this whole thing, like this scene where Megatron swings his mace around and Frieza's dodging, or this breathtaking shot of Tank Megatron looking on as Frieza's death ball looms over the planet. There's also a lot of great wide shots overlooking the planet of Cybertron during the animation, like during their beam struggle, or during this last shot that shows that Frieza's not destructo discs cut the entire planet in half. This episode has a lot of great shots and great lighting that really makes it stand out amongst the rest of the episodes this season. But for every outstanding shot or great lighting effect, there's another shot that lasts 10 seconds longer than it should. Yeah, this is the big issue I've seen people take with this episode, and it's that the pacing is really whack. And it's not like a Stitch vs. Rocket situation where there was a single shot that felt like it went on for a bit too long. There are at least 3 different shots that feel like they go on for way too long, and in some cases, way too long. 2 that are pretty long but not that big of a deal is the shot with the death ball approaching Frieza that goes on for a bit longer than I think it needed to, and the shot of Frieza getting up, very slowly popping his neck and then firing a death beam, which were slow but not that big of a deal. No, the greatest sin of this animation was Frieza's golden form transformation, which lasted a total of nearly 20 whole seconds, 17 to be precise. I understand it's a reference to his actual anime transformation, but holy cow, dude. You couldn't have thought to speed this up a little bit more? Especially considering when he transforms into Black Frieza later, it's not given nearly the amount of spectacle that Gold was. He just pops into it like it's no big deal. Meanwhile, he kills the entire pacing of the fight just to show off his golden form. Then again, I guess that's very accurate to the transformations in the actual anime, because Golden Frieza had this big spectacle behind it and Black Frieza just pops out of nowhere. Anyways, it's by far the biggest issue this episode has, and it is, in my opinion, what sets it back from being really outstanding. Fortunately though, it's not nearly enough of a downside to say that I dislike the episode. Far from it actually. I think this fight, despite its very noticeable flaws, is really enjoyable. And they managed to succeed on the 2 things I was really wanting out of this matchup the most. I wanted them to banter a lot, and I wanted them to pace out Frieza's transformations accordingly. While I do love Vegeta vs. Thor, I will agree that the way they pace out his transformations, Vegeta's, with him jumping from base to blue evolved over the course of like a minute, was really dumb and I really wasn't a fan. This fight, however, does not share that issue. Probably because Frieza has less forms to work with than Vegeta does, so it's easier to pace those out. But I do like how Frieza spends most of the time in his base form, and only jumps to Golden when he's being pressured, and only jumps to Black Frieza when Megatron starts getting under his skin. Some people might say that they wish Black Frieza was on screen more, but considering how little we know about the form and how little it's been shown, I think it's best they use it sparingly and not try to have it overstay its welcome just in case they get something wrong. Because even in the short time it's here in this episode, it's still on screen longer than it was in the manga, which is really funny to me. Speaking of getting under Frieza's skin, the banter was probably the thing I enjoyed the most about this episode. And that was the main thing I wanted them to take advantage of. These 2 characters are known for their boisterous and overconfident attitudes, and having such high egos clash like this can lead to so many great interactions, which it did, and it definitely helped with the voice performances. Little Karibo, aka Martin, is back from his outstanding work on Dragon Ball Z Abridged to play Frieza again, and as per usual, he knocks it out of the park. I don't need to explain to you all why Martin's Frieza is great, y'all already know that. Though I do wish some of his lines had a bit more energy behind them than what he did. But besides that, I literally have nothing negative to say about his performance. Tom Shock as Megatron, on the other hand, was also really outstanding. And he did a really good job at doing an impression of Frank Willer's iconic performance of the character. He gets some really good lines throughout the fight, and of course an amazing speech at the end. Speaking of which, let's go back to the banter. There's quite a few interactions that happen throughout the course of the fight that I've really enjoyed. Their initial conversation when Frieza comes for Cybertron, Frieza's following line after he turns into his final form was really cool and really well delivered, and I also appreciated the little reference to his Dragon Ball FighterZ intro during that animation. There's this scene where Frieza taunts Megatron and Megatron responds appropriately. Then there's the final interactions, which I'll touch on more when we get to the death. Another thing about this episode that really surprised me was the surprisingly creative fight choreography. While Dragon Ball episodes on Death Battle usually have a track record of being really good, they all kind of have choreography that delves into the same stuff, unless you have unique cases like Roshi or Xenotrunks. But this episode had a surprising amount of interesting moments. Megatron using the panic bubble to pin down Frieza, Frieza firing a bunch of death beams but Megatron using his mace to stop them before firing the mace at him. Then there's this really dynamic shot of Frieza dodging the mace and circling Megatron as he fires him. And then there's this even better shot that I already mentioned of Megatron swinging the mace around and Frieza dodging him. Then he uses his little paralysis ball that I spam way too much in fighters and sends Megatron into the ground, and we get an explosion that, like many other scenes in this fight, go on for a bit too long, but it's not that big of a deal. Then there's this scene where we get the only bit of transforming in this Transformers episode. I mean, I don't necessarily blame them. Trying to implement a tank into a fight with a Dragon Ball character no less seems kinda difficult. And plus, Optimus only transformed I think like twice during his episode, maybe 3 times, I can't remember. Even still though, I would have liked for them to implement Megatron's other transformations into the fight somehow, but I understand why they stuck with just the one and only used it once. Even still, I like what it offers. I love how in response to Frieza creating a giant death ball nearly the size of Cybertron itself, Megatron fires into the ground to rocket himself into space, then transforms back into his normal form and fires a giant blast of his own, only for Frieza to use his telekinesis to crush Megatron between Cybertron and his death ball. That is a really awesome display of power that I wish more Dragon Ball episodes and just episodes in general did more. Now we arrive at the final scene, where we have Megatron on the ground, looking completely undamaged, alright, and we get a very in-character line for Frieza, including a reference to the 5 minutes meme, which I thought was a nice touch, and it didn't really feel forced at all as well, which I was glad about. And I liked how he didn't finish all the way, and Megatron cut him off in rage, which is good. It wasn't like fully ripping it off, it was just like, oh, 5 minutes, and then he just gets cut off. Then, we get not even probably, just the best line in the fight. This speech from Megatron is absolutely amazing, perfectly capturing the character and also being delivered incredibly well by Tom Schalk. And the last sentence of the speech, that "what a fool" part, is delivered with so much venom in his voice, and I love it. I also love the visuals with the antimatter radiating around him while he talks. It's a really cool image. And I also loved how he started getting under Frieza's skin. Frieza is a character that hates when he's being challenged or belittled, so the fact that this speech is what ticked him off is very in character for him. And his rebuttal was also very in character and delivered well by Martin. And I like how this is what gets him to transform into Black Frieza. He's no longer toying with Megatron. He wants to utterly decimate him for challenging him. Then we get a cool shot of Black Frieza staring down Antimatter Megatron, and we get another great line from Megatron as Frieza gets hit with the antimatter. Now, I think this could have been a great fake out, and I could have seen it fooling a lot more people if they had lingered on Megatron for a bit longer afterwards before the Destructo discs come in. Kind of like what Vegeta Thor did, but I think it does its job well enough for it to be like, oh my gosh, did Frieza lose? And then it's like, and then it immediately cuts you off. It's like, oh no, he didn't lose, he's fine. Anyways, we get another reference from the Goku Frieza fight, and I honestly wasn't expecting them to work this in, especially as well as they did, but it worked, and it was a really great final interaction between the two. Also, like I said before, this shot of the disc going through Cybertron is such a cool visual with the purple and blue. I know I've said it a few times already, but I'll say it again. The visuals in this episode are absolutely outstanding. Then we get another amazing shot of Frieza standing in the midst of Cybertron's detonation, and we get one more line from Frieza that's delivered with absolute venom by Martin to close out the episode. And it was a great way to end it. What a phenomenal ending to this episode. And that's Frieza vs. Megatron. Gonna be honest, this episode really did exceed my expectations. Maybe because of how polarized this matchup was amongst the community. What with Nemesis making that video a few years ago explaining why he doesn't like it and whatnot. Now, obviously, this goes without saying, but don't go over to Nemesis bragging about how he was wrong about the matchup because this episode was good. Because if Death Battle has taught me anything, bad matchups usually lead to the best episodes sometimes. They don't always, but there are a lot of exceptions to bad matchups being made into good episodes. I am under the belief that a bad matchup does not equal a bad episode. And I don't think vice versa. I don't think a good episode makes a bad matchup better, if that makes sense. But anyways, I think this episode is great. Despite some weird pacing issues, they really did take advantage of everything that makes these characters unique and fun in their own way, and implemented it amazingly into this fight. The choreography, the dialogue, it all just fits together really well. If there was one thing that I wish that they did do, but I understand why they didn't, is have their respective armies fight in the background. Like, could you imagine an Eggman versus Wily kind of situation where in the background of Frieza and Megatron's fight we got glimpses of the Frieza Force and the Decepticons fighting? That would have really added towards the atmosphere this episode was going for, I feel. But again, I understand why they didn't go with it. It probably would have taken a lot more time to make, but anyways, I should probably rank this now. Yeah, I think I'll give Friezatron an 8 out of 10. It's a really great episode with a lot of great moments. But with one of the rundowns being kind of repetitive and really lackluster, and the really whack pacing issues during the fight, I think it makes sense to keep it at an 8 here. It might go up to a 9, it might go down to a 7, depending on how I'm feeling. But it was a good episode. I will watch it again in the future. I can definitely see myself watching this episode again. And now, next time. This is the Halloween episode after all, and we got Gojo versus Makima. Alright, look. I don't hate this matchup. It's a completely fine matchup, and I'm glad that people are happy. And I'm glad to see Gojo get on Death Battle. But the first thing that came to my mind when I saw this trailer was, could have been Urahara. You all probably already know this by now, but Urahara from Bleach is my preferred opponent for Gojo, so I'm naturally a bit upset that they went with Makima instead of Urahara, but whatever. I get why. It's the most popular option for both. JJK and Chainsaw Man are super hot right now. Plus, I think some weird stuff happened with Gojo in the manga. No spoilers, please. So, yeah, it makes sense. I think I would have rather them do Yuji versus Denji first before doing this, but it's fine. I'm sure the episode will be great, but, you know, I was just talking about how a bad matchup doesn't make a bad episode and vice versa. But, in the back of my head, throughout this whole thing, could have been Urahara. I'm just going to be thinking that throughout the entire time. Probably not the entire time. I'm overreacting a little bit. I'm not that upset about it. I'm kind of upset about it because Gojo vs. Urahara was one of my most wanted episodes, and that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. I'm sure there's a very real possibility that it'll happen in the future, but, you know, for right now, I'm just going to have to settle for Gojo vs. Makima, which is fine. I'm happy to see Gojo in Death Battle regardless. I think it's going to be great. I will probably skip over Gojo's rundown because I want to avoid manga spoilers for JJK since I've been catching up on that series lately, and I want to remain as spoiler-free as possible. And I know some crazy stuff happened recently, like I said before. Again, please do not spoil. Greatly appreciated. Chainsaw Man, on the other hand, I don't really care about, so I don't mind getting spoiled a bit on that. I am actually interested in learning about Makima, though, because everyone seems to love her. And she seems like a really interesting character, so I'm a bit interested to learn more about her. But yeah, Gojo vs. Makima, I guess. Alright, that's about it from me. Thank you guys for watching. Check out some of my non-Death Battle videos if you'd like to see more of my content. I had a Netflix One Piece review come out like a week or so ago. I don't know how long it's been by the time this video comes out, but regardless, maybe go watch that. It's a pretty good video. Or check out my Xenoverse video, because apparently people really like that. It's especially topical right now because a new Xenoverse update came out recently, if I'm not mistaken. Anyways, that's all from me, and I'll catch you all later.